wireframes would work. I haven't done one of these in a minute. Hey, Annalise. Just creating a basic sort of grid situation, or pattern that's sort of abstracted and then coming back in and throwing some of those blockheads in there, but doing it not as much like right angles as I was doing before. So actually I might just do this with Sharpie. Some bold lines going. I usually avoid the Sharpie because it leaves ink on the edge of the ruler a lot of the time. So at this point, just in some sort of lines going. I'm seeing how this will look. And now let's see. Blank finger, wrote across here. Got some mark on it. It's not terrible. I guess it dried fast enough. Let's keep that edge as my drawing edge. You have a circle. I have a smaller circle. This looks like a flag or something. The plan is to then come back and take this more abstracted thing and put those faces in there. The blockheads, as I like to call them. Split this guy. I need a triangle. There's a triangle there. Make this more of a triangle. Okay, so there's your face guy there. Oh no, don't mind me. The edge of the ruler has little bits of ink here and there. Just kicking stuff. The inspiration is stuff and things. The sounds of sketching on here, it's somewhat exaggerated because this is a frame, like a wooden panel, but it acts as like a small drum of sorts, and so any sound gets a bit more exaggerated because it's amplifying it. Hello, Kyra? Sorry if I'm saying your name completely wrong or weird or anything. I'm going to try to do this with it being stationary. Kira. Okay. Sorry for... Did I read? Okay. I'm always worried I'm gonna completely mess up people's names when I just read their usernames. Sometimes I'm like, I recognize this element of it, but then I realize that doesn't sound like a real name. Or it's like I read Matt and I'm like, hey Matt, and then I realize that it's Matthew. Or if it were to come to my name, which is Matthias, people might say Matt, and I'm like, that's not really my name. Is this whole thing in frame? Yeah, it is. Tracing paper is what this paper is called. Hello. We'll have. There's a high likelihood that I'll say your name incorrectly based on what your username is. Patham Fahim Khan. Thank you, Agricultress. Hello, Psycheron. I know that I don't have the strongest awareness of how to pronounce largely non-Anglican names, but I know that I do not have a good... say her name is in reference to a woman who was killed by police in Louisville, Kentucky. Last time I said that, people made fun of, or one person made fun of how I said Louisville. We just sort of slurred together. But a woman who was killed by police in her home and was part of a collection of individuals who were killed by police recently in the United States and have become figures relative to movements that aim to reevaluate how policing takes place and better serve the citizens of the United States and others. Let's say her name is in reference to Breonna Taylor, and I'd spent a good amount of my life, not a terribly large, but I lived in Louisville for a period of time, and so that had a different resonance with me, seeing more familiar places from middle and high school on a national and international stage relative to police violence. And her instance of killing was in a situation where she was at home and police issued a no-knock warrant for arrest, and they broke in, and general consensus for most of the witnesses is that there was no announcement made, and so there was no clear understanding that the people breaking into the apartment were police officers, and her boyfriend who was there shot back at police officers, and they shot additional rounds, and Breonna Taylor was killed. And so it's a different situation where there's very little to contest with. There's not a narrative that she was actively resisting arrest or acting in a violent way. And so her story became more of a national point. But that's what Say Her Name's in reference to. My stomach's making noises. Hello, Monger. I don't know why I put an R in there. Mongeton. Hello, Ryan. I can read that one more easily, which is a reflection of the fact that I grew up in the United States. Gracias. I know enough Spanish to struggle through it. And I can read it better than I can speak it or write it. This project is just creating a design based on this more abstract form that I drew in the background, and then filling it in with these characters. These, I call them blockheads. Hola in Uruguay. I sent a shirt to someone in Uruguay recently. I must learn Spanish. Necesito. I don't know how to say learn. I know how to say write and listen and speak. Hello. I always forget your name, which I apologize for, because I just recognize your icon. Making noises in my stomach. Yep, I ordered some new glasses out of curiosity to see what it looks like, and it changes the perception of my face shape, which is interesting how much those sorts of things can affect what you look like and how people perceive you. I also, earlier this year, shaved my head, not completely, but did a buzz cut, and it changes what sort of vibe I give off in a big way. And it's interesting to see how things that aren't your actual features or stuff affect people's understanding of who you are and what you look like. There's some digital elements, depending on what it is that I'm making. I typically work analog. It's my preferred method. But in this instance, because these aren't moving and the texture of the paper isn't as much an element of the final piece, I will be filling in the solid sections digitally. Hello, Karen. I'll just make this one sort of standard. my pulse. I prefer my stomach is making noises. I prefer analog. It has a bit more character, and my sense of control is better with analog. Depends on who's working and how they're working as to what their experience is with their mediums. Age 12 or 13 maybe? I don't remember what age I started animating. I don't have like a clear cut thing for when I first tried animating. When I was in college was when I started animating more in a sort of style and hand-drawn sort of things. Inspiration, a lot of it comes from just trying to learn how things work and then repurposing them for a creative space. I like how things communicate complex ideas through simplified means. Not someone who finds inspiration in too much of a specific place, but process is a big part of my experience and what I want to work with and convey. It's how things work. Cool. On your animations. Okay, now we will scan this. I name stuff afterwards if I name it at all. And usually it's just a reflection of whatever movement I created. I'm trying to name it in a way that's unique, distinct enough to where I don't feel like I'm going to confuse myself later on in the naming conventions. I'll do the slow version. Oh, this isn't a title. This is in reference to Breonna Taylor. Say her name. I'm trying to be against police violence and brutality and police reform to better reflect the needs and the wants of the population in a just and non-murderous way. Okay, so now gonna come in here, darken this a bit. And let's go a little bit more methodical. This saves a lot of time if I'm not as concerned with the texture of the paper and how it moves. It's a bit small. I just need to do a quick visual confirmation of the fact that this is not missing any solid sections. I think it's good. I need to change the size for the moment. A little bit here. Right there. Now we'll save it as JPEG. Pause on that. Grab this image. And there you go. It's a little smaller. I use tracing paper to animate because it's less of a strain on my eyes than using paper and a light table. And I like the fact that tracing paper is thinner, so the effect that the medium has on the paper itself is greater. So when you put moisture on, you take tracing paper and you put moisture on it, it'll warp a good amount. Whereas if you take just a standard sheet of paper, it doesn't warp quite as extensively. So let me mute this for a moment. So this has larger waves that are less frequent, and this one has many. So there's the texture that's created on that paper, and here's the texture that's created on the tracing paper. It's a lot more exaggerated. It's got more texture happening. Sometimes when I'm working, I forget how the screen is looking. And tracing paper is translucent, so when you're looking at the frame that's previous, the piece of paper underneath it, you can see through that, and then there's a greater amount of it obscures the paper below that further and further and further. Hello, Adrian. So it lets you know where in the animation you are when you use tracing paper in that way, and you don't need a light table, which gets kind of exhausting using. And I might have more success if I were to use a light table and a different selection of paper, because I've just used standard printer paper, copy paper, which the texture of the paper itself affects what it looks like for the frames that are behind it. And so I started with tracing paper, and I prefer it. I'm not sure how much of that is a reflection of the preference and how much of it is a reflection of the fact that it's just my experience with it, that I've found comfort in it, so I know how to work it. It's the sort of thing where it's hard to discern which one really is the driving factor, but it's my preference. Prints on the t-shirt, I create a digital version of this file and then I upload it to a printing service that uses direct-to-garment printing for the shirts that I'm sending out. And so how that functions, it's not a screen print, where for screen printing there's more physical work that has to be done in preparing the printing mechanic of it. It's a sort of thing where I can draw a graph, use that understanding of basic graphs that I learned in elementary school and then later. So, like, let's say you have, this is the number of shirts, and this is the cost. If you're doing direct-to-garment printing, it's done one by one by one. So unless you're working directly with a printer and you're doing a massive order and they cut you a discount because it's such a large order, the cost is just going to go at a right angle. It's a direct reflection. If you have one here, it's one here. If you have two here, it's two here. 3, 4, whatever. It's a direct line. And so there's no upstart cost. If you have 0 shirts, it's $0. But if you're working with screen printing, there's more physical elements that have to be put into production. And so usually there's a minimum number of shirts because it's such a, there are a number of things that have to go into the production of it. But if you were to say have one shirt, it would cost probably about the same to do one shirt as it does like doing 7 shirts or 12 shirts. So usually I have a minimum order, so it would like go all the way here, and then it would be a slow increase, a much smaller increase in price as you increase the number of shirts, because the time that it takes to print using screen printing is much smaller once you've actually begun printing. Because direct-to-garment printing, it functions like an inkjet printer. So what you have is a printer that has a selection of inks, and it is slowly going across the shirt that's been prepped on a surface, and it's dropping tiny bits of ink as it's moving along. And then it resets and does it again, and it does it line by line by line by line by line. And that works great for smaller numbers of shirts, or a moderately quick turnaround, depends on who you would be getting for your screen printed shirts and what their availability is, stuff like that. So it works great for one shirt because you don't have to prepare any physical elements, whereas with screen printing you have a mesh screen that's stretched across a frame somehow, and you have to physically go into that screen and somehow block out elements of the screen so that when you use a squeegee and push ink through the screen, it doesn't push through the entirety of it, it only pushes through the areas that are open. And so you have to prepare the screen for that, which means typically for commercial screen printing, you have to print out some sort of film or draw film, which is something that's a black piece of artwork that is ideally for best results against a transparency. Then you have to coat the screen with a light sensitive material, let that dry in darkness, and then you have to take the film in the screen that has the light sensitive material spread across it, and you keep them flush against one another. Oftentimes you'll use a vacuum table or something like that, and that vacuum table is, depending on what your exposing unit is, against a large sheet of glass or plexiglass. I think usually glass, because it's a little bit more rigid. And then you vacuum. You have a large piece of rubber or some other material, and you have a vacuum that's pulling air underneath, and it flattens it flush against there, and then it's against that glass, and there's a bright light that exposes the bottom, and wherever on that film that you had that was black, it absorbs the light, and so it doesn't set the screen. Then you expose it for a period of time, depends on various factors, like brightness, how detailed, what you have going on, mesh count, the sensitivity of the emulsion is the light sensitive material that you put on the screen. Then you take it out and you rinse it out, and wherever that light was being absorbed by that black, it didn't set the material, so it just washes out of the screen, and what you're left with is anywhere that there wasn't black, it is set in the screen, and it'll block out the ink when you come back with a squeegee and push the ink through. But there are also additional steps after that point to then prepare it for printing. It depends how you're working and what sort of setup you have, but for what I've done, it's typically one color printing, and so you have to rinse it out, then you have to let it get bone dry, and then you have to somehow block out the edges where ink could seep through, or if there's any places where the emulsion didn't set as well as you wanted to, and you have pinholes, little holes where ink could get pushed through, and you can take care of that a few different ways, but my experience is typically using packing tape. So you tape off all the sections that you don't have covered, but you don't want ink going through. Then you put it into some sort of hinge mechanism. I just have simple ones that you twist, and then you ink it up and you push the ink through. And the amount of time that you're actually making contact with the screen and the shirt is maybe a few seconds. Depends on how dark you want it and various things. But so there's all this setup, which is why the cost is initially much higher. But then once you hit that initial production, the time and money that is required to produce more shirts is much smaller an increase than if you're doing one where every shirt requires like 2 to 3 minutes. So because I'm doing such small quantities and I'm uploading a bunch of different designs, I just use those print services that do direct-to-garment printing, which is like an inkjet printer, because I can have as many designs as I want to, and update it as frequently as I'd like to, and it doesn't negatively affect the cost of production. So it fits well for what I'm wanting to do. But if I were producing a larger number, or if I wanted to have specialty inks, there's a little bit more, because the machine for printing and direct-to-garment printing costs like 10 grand or something. It's a very expensive piece of equipment that is finicky and has more specialized inks because it's got much more not finite, it has a greater fidelity to the equipment that's involved, and it's more sensitive. So the ink and the printing is typically such that it looks kind of like a water-based ink. It's not like screen printing where it's like sitting on top of the material if you're using a plastic-based ink. And so it's a little bit more limiting in that regard, but it's more fitting for what I am looking to do and what I am doing. So that's a general thing about how I'm able to make shirts as quickly as I am. And the fulfillment is a little bit varied depending on where you are and what you're purchasing as to how quickly those are fulfilled. There are a few different printers that will actually fulfill the prints, and they're located in different places. And sometimes there's lower supply, and that can lead to delays, as well as having more complex orders or just various things lead to issues on occasion because I don't have direct contact with the printers themselves. Where most of the last screen printing that I had done professionally, it was a local shop and they did a good job. They were able to go decent size. Hello, Helena. But they were able to go a decent size and do water-based and have a different sort of consistency and thicker, more solid blacks. But I had direct communication with them and was able to talk through processes. They were nice. Jersey City screen printing. I'm not sure what their sort of protocol or how they're doing work currently, but they just liked a lot of my reels while I was working on stuff. And you can work with them to try and find the best sort of process and such for your needs. And most places have a minimum order of like, very minimum would be like 20 shirts because it's all that setup process that once you hit that mark, it's pretty inexpensive, but the setup is the time and money. And so it's not worthwhile to only print like one shirt. Even though I've done that for myself, it takes a long time. Yeah. Any questions? I went on for a while about that print process. If you want to get a shirt, you can order one. This shirt printed pretty well. I was curious about it. That's why I ordered it. You have a little bit sense of texture. It'll fade a tiny bit, so it's something where I think it works. It doesn't quite communicate as clearly the texture and the fidelity of the squeaky. I also have this printout, which you can't see through that. The texture of the paper comes through, and it's a little bit harsher, a little bit more absolute because it's a print on glossy paper using a higher resolution sort of print deal. Printing on shirts, you're never going to get like a super crisp edge to anything because the texture of the fabric itself isn't as set. I can sell prints. This one worked out okay. I was testing it, but it's a weird thing because the shirts, there's less of a sense of scale or aspect ratios and such because the shirt has a set area, but t-shirts don't have as clear an understanding of where things start and end. You can have a very small thing on a shirt and it doesn't seem like it's weird print size wise, but there's only a few set dimensions. I actually had to cut that one down, but if you are interested in a print, I can work with you and try and talk through how it would go. It would probably also be a bit more expensive than a shirt, just because it's a little bit more expensive to produce through the service that I'm using. I was trying to make it in a way that it would be automated by the print service that I'm using, and that's where I have a little bit of trouble. It would be easier for me to find a smaller print shop to produce prints, but then again, likely to have a minimum order, and then I'd have to deal with the shipping and handling and such, and there's an added cost of purchasing mailing material and a responsibility there that I'm not as inclined to be responsible for. Thank you. Up, lile, lom lay lile, lom lay lilom. Got a lot of L's and I's. So, any other questions on things? I can talk a lot about printing and stuff like that. I have a lot of interest in the mechanics of how things are produced and exist. If no additional questions, I'll be heading out. I was gonna be like, it's in the scanner, the actual outline, but this guy will be available for shirts soon. Silk screen printing. I talked about that. I've done screen printing. There's just a bit more setup, and the amount of effort that goes into it produces. You have to commit to the shirts in a different way, where doing one shirt takes so much more time. And then it takes about as much time as doing like 10 shirts, just because it's all set up. But I have in the past, I still have stuff for it, and I actually have some screens here that are just not in a great state of things, and I don't have a setting to actually be printing. But it's very accessible if you want to try it on your own, but the upstart cost of it would be significantly more than if you, it would be not significant, but it would be a decent amount more than if you were to find a print service online and have them fulfill a shirt if you're just doing one and you're not as interested in the process of it itself. I don't know any Turkish music. You can do, screen printing on paper. I've done, you get a very nice quality if you have decent ink for printing on paper using a silk screen, if you have a high enough thread count. If you have a low thread count, you can get what ends up looking like pixelation, but lower mesh count is what it's called, not thread count. But it's the same idea, how many strings of material you have in a given inch. You get a completely different sense of solids and texture and feel if you are printing on paper, and you get nice paper. Screen printing paper that's nice and smooth and accepts the ink pretty well can get pretty pricey though. You get solids in a different way than any other print methodology. The designs don't have to be simple for screen printing. It works best with solids, decent sized bits. You can have some issues if you're trying to print very thin lines with screen printing, especially if you're using photo emulsion, because it has to be thick enough to bridge the gap between the woven threads, and if it's too thin, or if you're not careful with it, if you let ink dry in it, if you have material that has some, it happens more with shirts than other things, where the screen and the moisture might pick up elements of the print surface. You can clog up the screen, and if ink dries in the screen, it's really hard to get out unless you're using like a really strong pressure washer or you're replacing the mesh itself. Screen printing is also limiting because one screen, one pull has one color. So to do a bunch of color, you can work with offset screens, but it's really annoying to line up things unless you're in a like more professional setup that has more specifics and absolute registration to it. But if you're working with like 3 colors, it's still a lot of work, and you have to expose or prepare 3 screens or sections of one large screen. But you'll get flat, solid colors that you can mix and just keep printing. And it'll have a quality to it that can exist in some relief printing, but any commercial offset printing or inkjet or laser printer, it's not going to get the same quality of it because to create that color, it's going to pull and overlay and mix a few different colors that are in tiny little dots that at a distance you don't notice, but if you get closer to it, you can't get as vibrant of colors as doing spot printing or screen printing, and it won't feel as absolute. It's the sort of thing that if you haven't noticed it, you probably never will, but if you have, then you become very cognizant of the varying quality of those print methods. Relief printing, where you have some sort of material that has a design carved into it, it's really hard to get nice solid colors because it's hard to like have a section of woodblock that you cover it entirely in black or another color and then push it against something and don't have the materials get a complete solid connection. If you're interested in doing just some printmaking in general, my first introduction to it was probably stamps and using paint, and you can use a potato if you're just going for simple shapes and you want a stamp color or something like that. You can just cut into a potato. It's soft, doesn't have any grain direction, really easy to carve, and you just blot it here and there. Next steps up from that is something like lino cut, where again there's no grain direction to the material. You can buy linoleum or soft lino or some other kinds relatively cheaply, and you don't have to prep the surface at all in the same way that you would with a woodblock print or something like that. And you can get relatively effective tools for lino cutting for like $10 to $15. And that was probably the next step, but you have to, at that point you're starting to introduce a greater degree of risk because you can really hurt yourself with lino cutting. Anything where you have a gouge and you're pushing, you have to just be cognizant of it and well aware of how much force you're putting on it, because if it slips it can cause some bad damage to your hand. Yeah, you can revisit. There's a lot of things in childhood introduction to art that it's very accessible and pretty cheap to redo, and it's something that I think a lot of people don't. There's a disconnect between what you feel like you're allowed to do as an adult, because it's like that's a childish thing, but you can do it. You don't have to have permission. You just need to get some like paint and a potato, and you probably have a knife. You don't need a super strong knife in order to cut into a potato. So lino cutting, and that's pretty cheap and easy, but you will probably need like a brayer, which is like a paint roller, but it's a rubber like elongated wheel, and you use ink and then you apply it and then put stuff on there. Depends on what you're studying and where you're studying, what your pursuits are. I don't know how to tell your parents. Don't know what your relationship is with your parents, and I can't ultimately tell you whether or not it's a good or bad decision for you to drop out of art school. There are so many variables, and I don't know the specifics, so I can't advise you one way or the other. But if you can come at it from a place where you feel that you are well informed, it would help probably for your parents if you could explain some sort of trajectory or plan, so that they know you have a sense of direction. That's one thing that's really assuring, I think, for a lot of parents, that when their children go to college, that they're following a pathway and there's a sense that there's a clear direction. And if you're dropping out, that might be disconcerting for them. But ultimately, it's your decision, and you and your parents can live with that decision in different ways. But I don't have a clear-cut answer. Just think and analyze what it is that you're actually wanting to, either what you're wanting to get out of dropping out of art school, whether or not it's you dislike the process, you think that it's there's a bunch of different variables happening there, and I can't tell you what to do for that. How be creative, make things often, and if you have an inclination to, regarding curiosity about a process or something, giving yourself the freedom to explore it and try things out. Accept that research, trial and error is going to happen, and you might have failure, but just continuing to, when you see something and it piques your interest for your own benefit, you can have hobbies, and that can lead to greater exploration and understanding of whatever creative pursuits you have. It's hard to say don't get discouraged, but if you are feeling discouraged, that's okay too. Don't let it be an end-all be-all, as generally don't work in absolutes is a good way to be creative. Not in the sense of like, this can never happen, or like, don't know what I'm trying to, how best to explain what I'm trying to say. The most creative people I know are the most curious people I know. People who allow themselves to pursue things and explore things, and and if you feel that you failed at something, don't let that be, hello in California. That's maybe one of the closer locations that someone has said hello from. But don't let failure at something at one point in your life mean that you can't revisit it. Hello in Turkey. That's what I've got used to, is things where it's international people. So it's funny to have someone say hi from California, but you are on the opposite coast, so got a time difference there. And Leia and Talia. I'm not super familiar with Antalya, or a second I thought you were typing Atlanta. Oh, hello and around. I don't know what time it is there. You're ahead of where I'm at, so it might be late there. Okay. I don't know cities in Turkey. I think the only one I know is Istanbul. I'm not well versed in the geography of Turkey. Thank you. It's very kind. Alright, I talked for like an extra 10-15 minutes. If you do have any other questions, you can throw them in. I'll try to answer them. If not, I'll drop off in a sec. Plan on having something tomorrow. Again, it might be a still. I need to do some chores and such. But 3 p.m. Eastern time. Okay. Hours ahead. Well, hope you all have a good rest of your day. I feel good because election results came through and it looks more positive than negative, but still good to see how Donald Trump responds, because I don't think he's done anything other than flounder the last 3 days. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I'll make this available. You can watch this full stream without the comment elements on YouTube. If you search TraceLoops, I'll post up a fast or time-lapse version of this as well as a still. Make shirt stuff available. If you live outside of the US and you're interested in purchasing a shirt, you can direct message me or email me, traceloops@traceloops.com, and I'll do my best to quickly respond to that. I'll hope for peace for the world. And I'll try to respond quickly. If you have any other general questions, you can direct message me or email me or whatever. Thank you. That's very nice of you. Yeah, thank you all for watching. All this stuff, again, same as always. And I'll plan on being back tomorrow. This next week, I will not be broadcasting as frequently or during the week at all, really. I don't think I will be. But I'll be back next weekend, tentatively. The world has a lot of stuff going on, and so a little jittery about just everything in general. Anyway, thank you, and bye-bye.